So I'd like to suggest we take a step back, right? Take a step back. And if we're thinking about economics and the climate crises and technology sort of as the water that we're swimming in, the question would be, what is the ecosystem in which that water exists, right? What is the even broader context? What is the evolutionary context that shapes our world? So I'm going to argue that we really need to think in particular ways about evolution and about the trajectory and the directionality that everything is moving in, so that we can start to see some patterns and start to see some possibilities for where we're going. Because life, I'm going to argue too, is not random. What's happening in evolution is much more than modification with descent. The second law of thermodynamics actually shows us that it's an engine of complexity, because complex adaptive systems effectively dissipate energy, right? And energy, there's so much energy being processed everywhere, and it needs to be dissipated. And actually, by creating more complex organisms, it helps dissipate that energy. So there's an internal drive in the universe to create more and more complex systems, right? So the fact that I am a complex system that is actually aware of evolution is not an accident, right? There's an internal directionality. So the question is, what are we being pulled toward, right? What is the directionality of where things are going? Because human development is just one aspect of an evolutionary process that has been happening for over 13 billion years, right? The universe is still evolving. We sometimes, I think of it as though that's what happened, and now here we are. But obviously, if we just think about it for a moment, it's an ongoing process. So the future of evolution is just as open and amazing as all the changes that have happened. We are the part of the universe that has become aware of its own evolution and its own development, and this is the insight that we need to really help us shape our educational systems, right? Because I think it would be helpful to think of education as the process by which we determine how to support, foster, and direct the development of our species, right, in the context of a larger evolutionary process. So we need to broaden our understanding of that and see that also it's the evolution not just of material reality, but also of the experience of that reality as well, right? Inside and outside, subjective and objective, there has been a development in both of those domains, you could say. So the directionality that we can see, if we look at it from a certain angle, is toward increasing complexity, but also increasing consciousness, right? So what are the implications of an increase in consciousness as manifested through our species? What can that look like? And how can our continuing to develop and become more conscious help to address the problems that we're facing at this very crucial moment in time? So this potentially could be our big human story, right? There's so many fractured narratives out there. There's so many perspectives that are holding different parts of the story and that are in competition with each other. And it's so hard to really have any sort of consensus, even in a small group of people, around what is the shared story of our humanity, of my tribe, of your tribe, of my country, of my race, of my identity and your identity. And I think it would really behoove us all to find ways to access this bigger story of our shared common evolutionary ancestry, so that we can find meaning and purpose in our lives in a way that's kind of that we all have access to and that we all have a part in. So, with that in mind, a big question is, what are the relationships between evolution and human development, right? How do we see human development sort of as a fractal subset of what's going on in this bigger evolutionary context? And what are our potentials as adults to keep growing? There are many ways to think about human development. There are domain-specific theories that are about certain kinds of intelligence or certain kinds of experience, and there are global theories that really talk about the overall development of human beings. The model of Piaget is one of the most well-known ones, looking at cognitive development, right, from sensory motor to pre-operational to concrete operational to formal operational. And we see that these seem to be somewhat universal stages or structures. They can be broken down different ways, but there's something quasi-universal going on here. It's important to name that all theories are dependent on particular methodologies and models. So there is no be-all, end-all explanation or model of human development. There is not a sort of myth of the given where it's like, this is the way it is, and this map or this model or this explanation explains it for once and for all. So that's not what I'm claiming tonight. I'm actually going to pull together many different models of development so that we can see how they kind of overlap, how they rhyme, how they harmonize. But every time you create a methodology or an assessment, you're going to enact data that maps onto reality in a slightly different way. And what we see is that there's many different ways to do that. There's many different assessments, many different tests, many different theoretical models to kind of hold the reality that is human development. And the way that they overlap and make sense of each other is what is important to see, right? So we're not focusing on any particular theory of human development. Rather, we're trying to open up a space of meta-theory where our overall, at this point in time, accumulated wisdom around human development can start to become clear and become better understood by more people. Because the more conscious we become, the better our models are going to get, right? The more we develop, the more we'll understand development. And the more sophisticated our relationship will come to the fact that they're just models and the map is not the territory, right? And to not get stuck into something like eugenics or something that really goes toward really naive, simplistic, power-driven orientations to assess other people, right? We're not talking about different kinds of people. We're talking about available perspectives, right? Perspectives that are available to everyone. You could think of them as frequencies or wavelengths or structures or shared resonance, but they're spaces of subjectivity, spaces of experience that are potentially accessible by all people, but there are many layered reasons why certain people experience reality in certain ways and why there are overlap more between some people and other people, right? It's a big, complex thing to try to understand, but it doesn't take away the fact that there are these pretty universal structures and commonalities, and we can see even when we really understand someone, we can see that we're sharing some aspect of our perspective with them, right? Even though there's lots of discord and dissonance and disagreement in the world, there is also lots of mutual understanding. So we kind of want to explain how and why that can be. But I just want to emphasize you can't really reduce personhood or any person or what it means to be a person to any developmental model or any level of complexity. So I don't want to fall into that. But with that said, we want to avoid developmental blindness, right? We actually need to acknowledge development if we're going to make sense of anything. It's part of what I'm arguing. So we don't want to deny it, but we also don't want to overemphasize it. But one way to think about human development is in terms of cognitive complexity, right? So here's images of two models, Kurt Fisher out of Harvard and Michael Commons also out of Harvard, who sort of look at cognitive complexity in different ways. And the model on the right is the model of hierarchical complexity, where a stage is an equilibrium of behavior. It's a form of behavior within a range of complexity in relation to an environment, right? So it's a way of capturing the range of complexity that someone is relating to the environment through. And each stage coordinates the actions of the previous stage, right? So you would go from, in the movement from concrete to abstract to formal to systematic to metasystematic, you would go from constructing stories of concrete facts to then being able to find abstract variables in those stories, to then finding formal relationships between those variables, to then finding systems of relationships, to finding common properties in systems, to then developing paradigms that actually explain the principles of relationships in different systems, right? So it just keeps getting more and more complex, and it transcends and includes. So it is a hierarchy. It is a growth hierarchy. It's a natural growth hierarchy where, by definition, one way of interpreting reality is more than another way of interpreting reality. And there's reasons why it's kind of hard to acknowledge that, because it's hard not to jump to a hierarchy of people, but we have to find to work our way through the challenges of that, because the explanatory power of understanding human development is so helpful when we're actually trying to get a grip on these big social problems. Because really, we all in the background have some sort of metaphysical framework, right? We all have a cognitive conceptual architecture. We're all philosophers, right? Some are just better than others. And to help more people kind of move through this progression and get more complex in their thinking and understanding the impediments to that, I'm arguing is one of the most important things that we need to be thinking about as a society, because right now we just don't have enough people thinking deeply and complexly enough about world problems to actually solve them. Another way of thinking about this, Robert Keegan, also a developmental psychologist out of Harvard, he's done a lot of work talking about how most of us are in over our heads, which is the title of a great book of his. And he also talks about what he calls the development gap, which is just another way of saying that the demands of society are outpacing our developmental maturity, right? There's a gap between what's demanded of us and what we're able to do. And there's so many examples as we go through life of being in environments and situations where we just don't have the capacity to really do what's being asked of us. And there's a lot of talk in the education space and the business world space about 21st century education and 21st century jobs and all the skills that we need workers and kids to have. We need a capacity for innovation and self-management and responsibility and self-direction and creativity. But when we're talking about 21st century skills, I think it's helpful to see that a lot of the time we're actually talking about stages of human development, right? We're talking about people who have actually gone through certain stages of complexity and are able to really manage the world that they're in. So the more we understand about those stages and about that process of growth, the better off we're going to be, because just saying the buzzwords isn't really helping anyone, right? So one way that Keegan talks about it is just looking at three major stages: socialized mind, self-authoring mind, and self-transforming mind. And in some large-scale studies that have been done, really just showing that the percentages of adults are really in between the socialized stage and self-authoring stage, right? So socialized being really kind of still group-centric, like you're mostly adopting the views and beliefs of those around you, not really able to think clearly and rationally enough for yourself to kind of stake your own claim to reality, whereas self-authoring, you're able to do that more. So moving toward a more systematic way of understanding things, to have your own personal, coherent sort of system of understanding that actually somewhat makes sense, and you're not stuck in the inconsistencies and paradoxes and contradictions of some given framework, whether it be from your culture or your religion or your family. And self-transforming really being moving more toward metasystematic and paradigmatic, where you're really able to critique the systems and become post-conventional and really not just be self-authoring in the sense that you have your own view and can stand on 2 feet, but really helping to create the sort of post-conventional new ideas that are going to help move society forward. So if our children are going to be system transforming and actually changing the systems that are making the world operate, they're going to have to be self-transforming, right? They're going to have to get to the point in their early adulthood, hopefully, where they're seeing clearly enough and complexly enough that they can actually start to change the systems that they are embedded in, right? We need to change our own environments instead of just being products of our environment. And that is a shift that can happen when you become conscious enough to be aware of and critique the environment that you're living in, right? As opposed to taking it as a given and trying to be successful within that environment, right? So that's often what happens sort of at this self-authoring stage. You see a lot of CEOs, you see a lot of successful people. They have the capacity to be successful within the system as it is, and they're still playing that game, that win-lose game, and they can be the winner, and they're much more likely to be winners than people who are stuck in that more socialized level of complexity. But they're not changing the game, right? They're still actually winning at a self-terminating game. So we have to get more people past that threshold to stop caring so much about winning the game and start caring much more deeply and passionately about changing the rules of the game. So these predominant structures, we can also see them not just in individuals, but we can see them in groups and cultures, right? So when we think of traditional society, modern society, postmodern society, right, we're seeing different demographics of complexity. We're seeing different percentages of the frequency with which different complexity of mind is showing up in different groups. So another way to think about this, another lens that's helpful, is thinking about values, right, and the evolution of human values. So we can see through history sort of the emergence of what we could think of now as traditional values, right? Order, hierarchy, purpose, rules, discipline, right? They've been around for thousands of years at this point, the basis of many of the world religions, and the sort of basis of what we think of when we think of conservatism a lot of time, like conserving those traditional values. But we saw beginning, widespread with the Enlightenment, maybe a little bit in Romanticism, definitely from the founding of this country and the French Revolution, you see a more rational, scientific, often more secular, advancement, progress-oriented view, right? We can think of that as the modern worldview, which gave birth to the modern world and all the problems that we were talking about in the beginning, right? There's this sort of dignity of the modern world and the dignity of modernity that gave us so much progress, so much science, so much knowledge, so much technology, and yet the disaster of modernity too, right? Because that worldview, that approach to reality, was a novel emergence at one point in time, but it has reached its terminal end, right? It's no longer historically appropriate in the 21st century. Like the modern orientation to life and the modern world is now anachronistic. It's not fitting with what we're facing now. And we've seen new perspectives emerging, right? New values emerge, which we could really see on the world stage starting from the 60s, right? Over the past 50 years, we've seen new values of compassion, sensitivity, diversity, networking, what we think of as green values, right, or postmodern values. So we see these showing up much more than we did in the past. So we see this unfolding spiral of values and identity, or what we could think of as value memes. And it's a progression of symbolic codes that we can internalize independent of our cognitive complexity. So this is one piece here that is important to tease apart, that there's a difference between content and structure, right? So now we're living in a world where all these value memes have emerged, especially these three big ones. The traditional world is present in our life, the modern world is present, and the postmodern world. They're all interpenetrating, right? And different groups of people are resonating with different values. But depending on where you live, what your subculture is, what school you go to, who your family is, you're learning what language to use, you're learning what concepts to use, but that doesn't mean that you've gone through the stages of complexity yourself, right? So if you're a child today and you have very progressive postmodern parents and you're learning all about diversity and equity and inclusion and you want to save the world and be super green, if you're 10 years old or 12 years old or 15 years old, you're still coming at that with a socialized mind, right? You have a socialized mind and you're adopting the words and the values and the language of your group. You haven't actually gone through the stage of being self-authoring and actually seeing that clearly for yourself, not to mention getting to the point where you can critique that family or that group or that school in a sort of healthy and adaptive and emergent way, right? So we still have to find a way to decouple just the values that people express and how complexly they're actually living in the world, because we need to be focused on moving people through stages of complexity and not just playing the right language games, not just sounding a certain way, when actually you could stagnate and kind of get stuck in a socialized mentality if you're in a group that you never really come to see the downsides of or learn how to criticize. So that's something that we can talk more to when we're thinking about education and child development and schools and how to help kids through those stages. Because we all have a complexity bias, right? And we all have values bias. We all intuitively prefer forms of reasoning that correspond to our own stage of complexity and our own structure, right? So we can see some inherent conflicts that are almost inevitable in society when different groups are resonating with these different levels of complexity and these different values. And every perspective sees difference differently, right? So when you're in a traditional structure, it's more ethnocentric, more group-centric. So it's more in-group, out-group, us versus them kind of dynamics, and you see difference more as bad or as other, and that's the root of a lot of problems. From a more modern perspective, you might see difference more in terms of individuality, like I'm just an individual, and differences play out in society based on merit. So you might buy into meritocracy, right, and think that, well, everyone's just an individual. I am who I am. I'm this self-authoring person who kind of does what they want, and other people are too, and we're all playing this game when there's winners and losers, and things play out differently, and so what? You know, you should have worked harder. You could have done better, right? That's a sort of common orientation or framework or frequency that people operate from. Or from a more postmodern perspective, you see difference as a result of oppression or injustice or power dynamics, right? So you see difference as bad in a different way. It's unfair, right? And everything has an explanation for why things are the way they are and why there's this lack of equality, but it's explained because of external factors, because you're starting to actually see more of those external factors operating in society, which is a great insight, but you can often lose sight of the insights of prior structures. The philosopher Heinz Fronnacht calls this time the great stretching out, where we have this great stretching out of different values. And really, for the first time in human history, we have all these different values bumping up against each other and living with each other, when that just wasn't the case in the past. Throughout human history, there was not that much diversity in terms of values and complexity within your tribe or your group or even your country, right? And it's really not since the 60s that we even see this sort of postmodern emergence that's causing a lot of social dissonance and fragmentation. So these are some of the bigger picture dynamics that we need to start seeing and objectifying and making sense of. Because so much of what we perceive and what we understand and what we believe is influenced by the underlying structures and stories about reality, right? And over time, some people bump up against those stories and start to question things and discover new clarity that resists assimilation into the old story, right? And that's how we get new stories, and we need to keep doing that. We need to keep doing that and deconstruct the old stories that we've been given so that we can build new ones, new stories that are more appropriate to the 21st century and the kind of problems that we're facing. So there's this principle here that I want to talk about too, of transcend and include as opposed to transcend and repress, right? So as we've seen these value structures emerge over time, we've seen repression historically on a grand scale, right? And denial of the value of other perspectives on a grand scale, right? So modern science and the emergence of modernity completely failed to include a lot of the good things about religious structures and indigenous wisdom, right? Like there are other perspectives that already existed, but when the sort of modern scientific worldview emerged, it just dominated to such a degree that it was hard to find examples of really healthfully integrating indigenous perspective, traditional perspectives, and modern perspectives all together, right? It's a hard thing to do as an individual, and it seems to be even harder to do collectively, but we're starting to see the negative outcomes of not doing that. And similarly with postmodernism, what we're seeing is that many people who enter into that sort of postmodern, socially critical stage fail to appreciate modern progress, right? We actually fail to really understand the importance of rugged individualism and the importance of scientific progress and actually finding ways to integrate the good and the bad. So one of the benefits of moving beyond the postmodern frame, which is part of what I want to get to, because I think a lot of people who are even going to be drawn to a talk like this, and a lot of people who are living in the world today and thinking about these things, are probably resonating more often than not with a postmodern frame and that sort of level of complexity more than a traditional or modern frame. But we need to start to see the inherent contradictions in the postmodern frame and start to think about and realize what could be beyond that, like what's next. And one of the aspects of getting beyond that postmodern frame is actually being able to develop a coherent meta-theory and narrative that can hold the truths of different perspectives while orienting us toward a shared purpose, right, and a meaningful life, which is hard to do from a postmodern frame because you're so able to criticize and critique and deconstruct and see the problems with everything that it's hard to really hold that there is the possibility of an actual meta-narrative or frame that can actually hold it all together. And you feel like you can't do that anymore because if I do that, I'm just some young white guy doing that, right? And that totally distances me from any notion of truth or validity. We've got to find a way to get beyond that and not let our limited identities and our limited stories keep us from accessing our larger identities and our larger stories. So complexity, values, and culture are the things that we need to understand a little bit about how they're developing. And we need to understand that human development is the meta-crisis of our time, right? It's not the climate, it's not the economics, it's not technology. Those things are real, and we need to make changes in those areas. But the only way to do that is to get more people who actually can grapple with those things from a higher degree of complexity. We need to see the process and change the game, right? See the process of what's happening and change the game that we're playing. The social game that we're playing of winners and losers and competition and acting like the collateral damage of the environment and social inequality aren't going to catch up to us. We need to be able to see through that and see through the process that got us there clearly enough that we can fundamentally stand firmly in a place where we're committed to not playing that game anymore and not letting our kids play that game anymore and not raising our kids to be successful in that game anymore. And it's about seeing everyone and everything as part of an emergent process, right, of unfolding perspectives and the seeing relationships between those perspectives and our environments. we must attend to the health of the entire spectrum. We have to understand that people are going to always be at different stages. You can't just demand that everyone be seeing things from the same point of view. It's more about understanding the whole process, how to meet everyone from birth to old age, where they're at, and hold their view in a larger context, and not perpetuate binary us versus them dynamics.